Hi, Misha here, and I've been kind of revisiting and expanding upon some aircraft, which is funny because I still have an archive of ones I haven't even shown for the first time, but hey, it's my channel, kind of do as I get in the mood for, and today I wanted to revisit the Messerschmitt Me.163B Komet, the first and really only production military rocket-powered fighter interceptor made in World War II during the Third Reich. And what an odd little plane. Of course, the 262, the first production jet, is famous. The V1, the V2. And I'm not saying the Komet's unknown, but I think compared to those, it does kind of play second fiddle. But what a story. And on the cake spinner, I have two models. The one on the left is from Oxford, and the one on the right is from American. Both are 1/72 scale die-cast, and both are relatively cheap. And this is one I don't so much mind being cheap, simply because there's really no moving parts. And it's such a small little model that paying more than 15-20 bucks would feel a little bit like a jip. And heck, the American even has a little pilot figure inside, which is neat. And both are pretty substantial metal and get the job done. Nice little example pieces. Well, work began in 1937. It started off with the German Institute for the Study of Sailplane Flight, the DSF, and very soon they would partner with Heinkel. Now, Heinkel was an early advocate of new technologies, jet engines, and so rocket engines were right there. The first prototype, DSF-39, was a simple glider sailplane, unpowered. The DSF-194 was similar, but it had a small piston propeller on the nose to give it some powered flight. And the first one to actually have an engine was the Heinkel HE-176. This was a bipropellant liquid rocket motor powered aircraft, and it was never meant to be production. It was just a proof of concept. And the team was led by Alexander Lippisch. But the problem was DSF really wasn't competent. They were behind schedule, they had trouble building even a prototype, yada yada yada. So, in early 1939, Lippisch asked to have the project transferred to Messerschmitt, which was granted. Of course, it took time to transfer the technology, which was good, because that gave the engine that they wanted to use, manufactured by Walter, time to mature. So by 1940, the basic wing and body were ready, and the basic rocket engine was ready. And by May of 1941, the two were combined. There were some towing tests, some unpowered gliding tests that summer, and then on September 1st, 1941, the Me.163 prototype AV0 first literally rocketed into the sky. Now, the 163A was always kind of a pre-production model. Once they decided the concept was sound, they went to working on the 16B in December of 41. And basically it was to correct some issues with the engine. They also went to a better undercarriage, which I'll talk about in a minute. One other feature that the German military, the Luftwaffe, wanted, the Air Force, was an engine that could be throttled. It wasn't just, wide open. And so, by 1943, the first pre-production 163As were built, and then this would lead to the production 163B. And what did they come up with? This was essentially a glider with a rocket put on the butt. Its body is under 19 feet long, but it has a wingspan of 30.5 feet. The wings are actually made of wood, as are a few other parts. It has a bipropellant. The fuel is called C-stuff, and the oxidizer is called T-stuff. It had enough fuel on board for 7.5 minutes of powered flight, so less time than this video takes, by far. It had a very interesting takeoff and landing cycle. If you look on the Merca model, one reason I picked it up, it has wheels on the underside. That was actually a dolly, or a carriage, that it would take off with and then jettison. And then it has a little wheel in the back, tail wheel. And then in the air, it would have a skid left, which could be retracted up into the body for landings. So it took off with wheels, but then would let go, and then it would land on a skid. And it was unpowered, so it would zoom up very fast, very high, and then it would literally glide back down, unpowered. It was a glider. And of course, once on the ground, it was helpless, and they actually had hauler tractors that would come up and pick it back up and take it back to the airfield. They would either pick it up physically and just haul it, or they'd pick it up and put it on its trolley and drag it back. So a little different. It was fast. This was the first aircraft to exceed 1,000 kilometers, which was over 600 miles per hour. And purportedly, one of these might have actually broken the sound barrier in 1944, or the experimental version, going over 702 miles per hour, but this is unconfirmed, and the Pitot 2 readings might have been faulty. Either way, it was damn fast, and it would take jet aircraft a decade to get that fast. So even though it had a very limited time, once it took off, it zoomed up. It could go essentially as high as the pilot could take it, because it was a non-pressurized cockpit. So oxygen deprivation and low pressure would take their tolls. Nevertheless, this thing could zip up 40,000 feet, and some versions could even get up to 50,000 feet, although those were experimental and they did have at least pressurized cockpits. They would take special pains with the pilots to give them special diets and special training in altitude chambers so they could resist. But nevertheless, it was hard on the body. And they would basically be interceptors. These were point defense bomber interceptors. When bombers would come in to an area, these would be scrambled. They would zoom up. They would try to go through the bomber formation, having one pass. And then as they came back down from altitude, they would get a second pass. And some pilots could manage another pass or two, but it took a lot of skill. As far as their armament, the first 20 or 30 Komets, as it was known, Komet, had 20mm cannon with 100 rounds per gun. But very quickly this was changed to two 30mm cannon, Mark 108, the same cannon that would be used on the Messerschmitt 262. So pretty punchy, with 60 rounds per cannon. Even though it was a very hefty little shell, it was relatively slow moving, and it still would take a few hits to down, say, a B-17 or a Lancaster or what have you. So very limited endurance. It was maneuverable even when it was still in glider mode. And to provide power, it had an acid-based battery, but it also had an electric turbine on the nose that would generate power through the air moving through it. So as long as it was moving, it would have power for the instrumentation and whatnot. Radio. Very interesting craft. Had a lot of shortcomings, but then it was really ahead of its time with some very, very profound performance features for its day and time. And it was relatively cheap to produce. Again, wooden wings, rocket engine. On the other hand, the C-Stoff and the T-Stoff fuel was not only highly reactive to each other, it was also caustic, even acidic to human flesh. So much so that ground crews and pilots alike had to wear special protective gear. So pretty chancy. And both propellants were clear, so yeah, it wasn't a good idea to mix them up. Obviously they had separate tanks in the plane, but still. Well, despite the shortcomings, the first training and evaluation squadron started to receive these in the summer of 1943, but they had to relocate several times, delaying deployment because of the war. And these first started to go into combat in May, so just before D-Day of 1944. And the most famous squadron that used these was JG 400. The plan was to surround sensitive installations like oil, gas production, metal refineries, factories, with rings of these. So they really wanted to make a lot of them. This never really came to fruition, though. Even though they started to deploy these in combat more and more after D-Day in July and August of 44, they never really made them in the numbers they were expecting. In fact, only about 370 Komets were eventually assembled by Messerschmitt. And they would continue to try to develop the design with the 163C, but it never went into production. It just had too many shortcomings. It was difficult. It required extremely skilled pilots to handle and take advantage of its short flight durations. And it was a very specific plane. It was not really flexible at all. It did one thing. It intercepted bombers. The combat record was mixed, to say the least. There were 9 confirmed kills, although some sources state as many as 16 planes were downed by these. Even some say 18, with most being larger bombers. Now, that was an exchange of 14 Komets lost. Now, to be fair, only 6 were lost in combat. The rest were lost to incidents. Many others, though, were destroyed on the ground before or after they took off. Because, again, especially on landing, they were highly vulnerable. They couldn't even crawl away once landed. So it never really lived up to anything like what they had hoped. And by this point, jet fighters were the wave of the future. The 262, and later Heinkel's own 162 Salamander. It's worth pointing out that Messerschmitt had been so busy with other projects like the Bf-109 and the 262 that actually by 1942 production had been transferred to Yonkers of Stuka fame, although the Stuka itself was obsolete by that point. It actually was passed around to a few different factories, so kind of just shows you where it's at. Even before the end of the war, most Komet pilots were pulled off this aircraft and reassigned to others, especially the Me.263, where they were put to better use. And the plane was pretty much forgotten. It continued to see some sorties in 1945, but not a whole lot. After the war, a number of these were carted off through Operation Lusty to America. Many more were taken to Britain. The Soviets got their hands on some. In fact, the MiG Bureau worked on a rocket-propelled plane of their own based on this for a brief time. And so Allies did try out the concept of the Komet, but yeah, I think the shortcomings outweighed the benefits, and of course, jet engines were becoming more and more efficient. But still a very interesting design. Cool looking plane too, I think. As far as the models here, the Oxford, which would be the same as the Atlas, really, is a nice solid die-cast model. But no landing carriage and no pilot. Whereas the American has a little pilot in there. Hopefully he's wearing his little protective suit. And we do get the wheeled undercarriage, which is a nice touch. Both of them had the pitot tubes and radio antenna and whatnot. Seems like the generator, the turbine on the Americans may be a little more detailed than the one on the Oxford. Have to admit, I like both, but I think the Americans a little nicer, and it's also a little cheaper. The Americans are about 15, 16 bucks. The Oxfords are more like 20 to 25 bucks. That said, I think the Oxfords are a little more durable. As I've said in other videos, the American plastic's a little fragile. If you take care of it, it'll be fine, but if you don't, drop it. Liable to snap something off. And both do come with a very comparable stand. I would say the American stand holds it a little tighter. It's more of a long slot, whereas the Oxford is just a simple peg. They're both good, but yeah. I'm also recovering the Messerschmitt 262 and the Heinkel 162, if you're interested. Any comments or questions, please do post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.